Welcome back to Introduction to Financial Services Industry. This video is going to be about asset identification, which is not everybody's favorite topic because it's a little bit specific. Again, I'm going to go through this at a high level, and there's nothing in here about investing advice, and this is all publicly available information. So, asset identification. It's impossible to buy, sell, borrow, lend, settle, report on, analyze anything unless you can first identify it as a specific security product, as a specific asset. So in order for us to trade in an open market all over the world, products, we all have to be able to identify specifically what is the exact product that's being traded. And I know that sounds simple, but there's a little bit of complexity here, and I'm going to try to take you through it. I'm going to start with a weird example here. It used to be years ago, if you wanted to sell a used car, you'd make up a little flyer, and on that flyer, you put out information that describes, it's indicative of this car. You're going to say what model car it is, what year it is. You might put the mileage. You might put how much money you're asking for it. You're going to put the telephone number of the person to call to buy it. You might go further and say, is this the 5-speed manual? Does this have 4-wheel drive? Does it have air conditioning? But the point is, when you advertise a product for sale, you have to be able to provide specific details on what you're selling so that when somebody that shows up doesn't think that you're coming and you're selling a different model or a different make or a different year. You need to be able to tell them what model, what the asking price is, what the age, the mileage, any features and options and ratings. Now, later on, they came out with Carfax, which Carfax made things very specific because it would tie into cars' VIN numbers. And you can then go into Carfax and you can go back and you can look up and you can say exactly, you can identify exactly what is the car that you're buying. So in the securities industry, in order to purchase securities, we have to identify assets because there are different stocks. There could be a Class A stock, Class B stock, Class C share, right? We were talking in another video about Google, the Google Class A versus the Google Class B and Class C. But originally this wasn't an issue because securities were traded as physical documents. So when securities were physical documents, they were pieces of paper, and printed on the paper was all the descriptive information. If it was a bond, it would say who the issuer was, what the maturity date was. It would say what the interest rate was, what the face value is. If it was a stock, it would say this is the common stock, this is the Class A issue, this is the Class B issue, right? But as we moved away from that, we got to faster processing. Everything became electronic. And we went through this electronic processing. There was a need to have more descriptive data to reduce confusion so we can be very precise in how we electronically trade this. And this is very, very big with bond products and any product really. The use of technology has made us go from, we no longer really do physical securities. Everything is pretty much electronic. Now, that being said, there are still people who hold Mickey Mouse and have physical securities. I use the example of Disney because people used to like to buy the Disney and get the physical certificates because it had Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck on it, and they could present the certificate to somebody at a birthday party or a bris or a baptism or as a present. But today, brokerage firms really don't like to handle physical certificates, right? They really want to handle everything electronic. Where things are electronic, That's called book entry. So it's like book entry at the DTC. So securities, we get rid of the physical securities. We go to electronic book entry registry of securities. Now, every security has an issuer. Somebody issues the stock, a legal entity that develops, registers, and sells the security. The issuers could be domestic, they could be foreign governments, they could be foreign corporations, but the issuers are legally responsible for the obligations of the issue for financial reporting, all the other stuff. The common things we're talking about preferred stocks and common stocks and bonds and notes and different securities, but they all have issuers. So that's one of the things we have to know when we identify the application, the asset is who is the issuer of the asset. It's funny, we look at this picture where the picture on the left of the young ladies, and I hope I don't get in trouble for using this picture. That shows young ladies in around 1890 reading off a ticker tape and posting on a chalkboard board prices of stocks. And it's kind of interesting because you can actually look on the photo and you can actually see the symbols, G, GE, different companies, and the prices, right? But over the years, different systems were developed in different places for identifying securities. There's the ticker system, there's RIC codes, there's CUSIP numbers, there's ISIN numbers, there's CDOL numbers, there's broker identification numbers that are like dummy codes of brokerage, Bloomberg Global Identifier, the Germany, I won't even try to pronounce it. The Valerian is what the Swiss use, the NSIN, the Sikovan number. There's all these different symbols that were developed in different places at different times, all for the purpose of identifying securities. So in this example, you'd see you see both the RIC code from Microsoft plus the ticker from Microsoft. We're going to get into a little more details, but the point here is there are different symbols for identifying assets, different systems, different methodologies that have been developed over the years for identifying. So the first one we want to talk about, though, is the RIC, is the ticker, and that dates back to the ticker tapes. So the telegraph, people would send stock information using a telegraph, and the telegraph used to charge companies for the number of words, the number of letters. So in order to save money, they used abbreviations. So they would use the shortest abbreviation so that it could be inexpensive. This is a good example where technology and financial services industry always intersect, right? One of the early adopters of the telegraph was the financial services industry, because having information is having power. It's giving you an edge. So tickers were original symbols, were just short symbols that were used to identify companies. So example of a ticker, by the way, you'll hear ticker or symbol or ticker symbol or stock symbol. They all mean the same thing. It's a ticker identifier, it's a short identifier. It's made of alphabetic letters that identify a stock. IBM is a ticker for IBM. Microsoft, their ticker is MSFT. General Electric is GE. But the history behind this all comes back to the old ticker tape machines that went back to telegraph. And the reason the symbols are so small was to be able to be fast transmission and low cost. And you guys have all heard of ticker tape parades. It used to be brokerage companies on Wall Street, Broad Street, would they'd save up. They'd have tons of these piles and piles of these ticker tape at the end of the day, and they'd save it up. And it was a big deal in New York to honor somebody. It would be to have a ticker tape parade, and people would open the windows of the buildings and throw them down. Now today, obviously, we don't have ticker tape anymore, and we don't have that piece of paper. And in most cases, the windows on these buildings in Wall Street won't open up, and half the companies aren't located on Wall Street or Broadway anymore. So it's a thing of the past. So ticker is one identifier, symbols identifier. Now, another way of identifying is something called the ISIN, which is the International Securities Number. So the ISIN came out as another way to uniquely identify a particular security for trading purposes. And it originated as part of the ISO 6166 standard. ISO is the International Standards Organization. They publish and support standards. ISINs were first used in 1981, but didn't really reach wide use until the late 80s. ISINs are very big internationally, and I'll explain why in a later slide. But ISIN is used to identify bonds, commercial paper, equities, warrants, and listed derivatives. And ISINs are 12-character long alphanumeric code. One distinction that the ISIN code doesn't change. One distinction is that the ISIN code doesn't change if a stock or a bond or a product is traded on multiple exchanges or multiple currencies it trades in. It's the same ISIN. No matter where the security is traded, no matter what country it's traded in or what exchange, it stays the same ISIN. And basically, to distinguish the exchange, they would add the exchange code. So an example of an ISIN would be here on the bottom, would be LT0000610040. And what that means is that there's a code to how to read that. And here's what the format is. The first two digits are a prefix for the country. And for instance, MX is the code they use for Mexico on ISIN codes. And the next digit is an alpha that identifies the region. So MX and then P would mean South American, would be the region. So Mexico in South America. And then there's a base number that identifies the issuer. So if you remember, earlier in this conversation, I went through a big discussion about issuers. I talked about how a country can be an issuer, a government can be an issuer, a corporation, a company can be an issuer, right? The reason why I went through that talk about the issuer is because now you see that issuers get assigned numbers, and the issuer number is based in the ISIN. And then there's the identity of the issue. So for instance, if IBM had a common stock, and then it would also have, let's say, bonds, different bond issues, the identity numbers portion, the base number portion of the ISIN would be the same for any IBM product, but the last numbers would denote, is it the corporate bond, is it the Class A stock, is it the Class C stock, is it some other bond or some other asset? And then the last character is a verifying check digit. Now, this is publicly available information. I put the website at the bottom for the ISIN.org. If you go to www.isin.org, you can read all about this. The next, and I talked about how ISINs are used internationally. The next identifier is called a CUSIP. CUSIPs are widely used in the United States. They're the Committee on Uniform Securities Identification Procedures. They're used in the United States and Canada. Most of your computer systems and applications that are based on U.S. dollar, U.S. exchanges, U.S. trading will most often use CUSIP numbers. Many applications and many brokerage firms, they list everything by CUSIP numbers. So you're going to find CUSIP number for products that trade in the United States. CUSIP number is going to be the identifier probably most likely used for the processing, settlement, and processing the security. And CUSIP has a similar format. It has a issuer code, which is a series of 6 characters. It has the issue. So again, we start with the issuer. The issuer is the corporation issuing the security, or it's the government issuing the security. So we start with a number, an alphabet number that identifies the issuer. Then we have a 2-digit character code that identifies the issue. Is this an equity? Is this a debt product? You know, is it a stock? Is it a bond? Then it has a check digit. So similar to the ISIN, but a little bit more specific in how it's used. And also, I'm sorry, at the bottom, you'll see www.qsip.com is the site where you can get more information on QSIPs. Now, the next one here is called the CINS, C-I-N-S, but it's the QSIP for International Numbering System. And basically what it is it's the same as the QSIP, but what they do is they preface it with a country code. So the country code for G happens to be United Kingdom. So if a security was a security trade, let's see, it's a stock traded on the London Stock Exchange, it would have a CINS number that would have G as the prefix, and then it would have a 5-character identifying the issuer, and the characters identifying 2 characters identifying the issuer, and then the check digit. Now, the next type of identifier that is used, and again, QSIP is used mostly in the United States. It's used widely in the United States, I should say. CIDOL is another identifier, and it grew up in the evolution of the London Stock Exchange, right? So the CIDOLs are issued by the London Stock Exchange, right? And they're the Stock Exchange Daily Official List. That's what CIDOL stands for. And it's, again, it's a standard. The London Stock Exchange will issue CIDOL numbers. It's widely used in European trading. So European stocks and European applications will have CIDOL. So you could have a stock traded in London, and it would have a CIDOL. It would also have a ISIN, and it would also have a QSIP. And depending upon the computer systems that are being used to process that trade and how they're coded, they might use different identifiers to point to the same stock being traded. And also, I mentioned here that there's also something called a market identifier code, which is used to identify markets, exchanges throughout the world. The CIDOL has a format. Again, it's a public format. It's the equation for it is listed here. And what you can do is, the reason they publish all this on the check digit is so that a computer programmer anywhere in the world can take this information and can verify that they have the correct CIDOL. If you look at the bottom, you'll see HTTP www.londonstockexchange.com. If you go to their website, they'll give you all the information on the CIDOLs. Now, there's another type of identification system. Again, it's an older system. It's called a RIC code. And that stands for Reuters Instrument Code. And that was developed by Reuters many years ago, as Reuters in the early 20th century became a dominant player in the communication of financial information. They came up with the Reuters code. And the Reuters code, and by the way, if you use this standard, you have to pay Reuters. Reuters is entitled licensing fee if you use this. But for instance, the Reuters code is fairly simple. It's the ticker, a period, and then a 2-digit exchange code. So for instance, Microsoft traded on the NASDAQ would have a RIC code of MSFT, which is the ticker, the symbol, period, OQ, which is the exchange code for NASDAQ, the over-the-counter market. So RIC codes RIC codes are not used as much as they were. They're still out there. I think people don't like the fact that if they use this standard, they technically have to pay Reuters for licensing it. And it's a pretty simple standard. And it doesn't really, it's great. It's a great standard for getting execution. Getting execution, all you really need is the exchange and the ticker. You get an execution. But for settlement and clearing and more complex transactions, the ISIN and the QSIP and the CDOL are more used. Again, the symbol for IBM traded on the New York Stock Exchange would be IBM.N, and IBM trade on the London Stock Exchange would have a RIC code of IBM.L. Pretty simple to follow. Again, I don't think you'll see RIC code used that much. There's other naming conventions, other asset identification systems that are more likely to be used. I mentioned earlier that there are MIC codes. MIC codes are market identifiers. They're a standard maintained by ISO, International Standards Organization. ISO 10383 is the market identification codes used for pretty widely. And you'll show like the BATS exchange has the MIC code of BATS. Now, where brokerage companies operate like exchanges and market makers, for instance, Fidelity, CrossStream, would have a MIC code. And the MIC codes are really useful in routing trades to exchanges for execution. So where you're dealing with order routing to execution, you're going to see MIC codes used. For instance, NASDAQ All Markets is XNA. Instinet is XINS, right? You're going to see, if you're really looking at identification of assets, identification of a transaction processing on the order routing side, where orders for a particular security to be executed via the exchange, you're going to see MIC codes. Now, this is where I try to pull the whole thing together. So if you didn't understand before, if I got you confused, hopefully this slide will bring it all together. In this slide, we have the example of IBM as an issuer. So IBM is a corporation, and they issue different securities. They issue different corporate bonds, and they have different issues of stock. They have preferred stock, they have common stock, and Class A, Class B, Class C stock. So there's a product level to it, different products. And let's say equity. So IBM has different equities out there. So there's an ISIN issued. If you follow this chart, there's an ISIN that's issued, and the ISIN is US 4592001014, and that ISIN represents IBM equity, a particular equity. I'm not sure whether, I think it's the common stock. But IBM common stock is sold around the world in different countries: Canada, the United States, Germany, Japan, Great Britain. So if I gave you this number, US 45920011014, you could, that's the ISIN, that's going to tell you, oh, this is IBM common stock. But it's not going to tell you which market we're trading in. Now the QSIP, there's a QSIP 459200101. That QSIP identifies IBM, this equity, traded in the US market in Canada. So this number, this QSIP, if someone gave you that QSIP, you would know exactly that we were identifying IBM common stock in the US market. And there'd be a different CUSIP in Germany as an example. Now, if you were buying IBM common stock in the US on the New York Stock Exchange, it would have a CDAL number. And this is the CDAL number, 2005973. That CDAL number is the number that would identify IBM common stock traded in the US, traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And if you bought IBM, that same stock, on the Boston Exchange, it would have a different CDAL. On the Chicago Exchange, it would have a different CDAL. On the NASDAQ or the Pacific Exchange or any other US exchange, it would have a different CDAL. As a matter of fact, if you bought on the German exchange, it would have a different CDAL. So whatever exchange is traded on, it would have a different CDAL. CUSIP, IBM common stock traded in the US are all going to have the same CUSIP. But IBM common stock traded in Japan or Germany or France or the Netherlands would have their own CUSIPs. They would have a different CUSIP because that's the level that the CUSIP identifies. But IBM common stock traded anywhere in the world is always going to have this one same common ISIN. So there's a hierarchy at play here. And the idea here is to provide information needed to identify the security for trading and settlement. So when you have the ISIN, you have part of the equation, but if you want to be more detailed, you would need the ISIN plus the country code plus the MIC code for the exchange. If you had the CUSIP, you would need the CUSIP plus the exchange MIC code. But if you have the CDAL, you have everything. A CDAL would identify the most granular definition. And what I also said earlier is, in many cases, the computer systems we use for processing these transactions, at different points of the transaction, they might use different identifiers for the same transaction. In executing an order, they often just use the ticker and then route it how they want from there. So that's my introduction to asset identification. I tried to simplify it. I know some of it's a little bit confusing. I would tell you that operationally and from a computer perspective, this is very important stuff. This is very important stuff. You can't do pricing without understanding this. You can't do a lot because obviously the Class C stock, common stock, or the Class B or the Class A might be priced different. They might settle differently. They might be loaned differently. It's very, very important in processing securities. If you have any questions, please contact me at the address listed here. Thanks. Have a nice